Welcome back to another episode of the Meat Mafia podcast. If this is your first time joining us, we have one goal and one goal only, and that is that you, yes, you, listen to this podcast and get at least one valuable piece of information that inspires you to go radically change your health today. If this is your second, third, fourth, or 100th time listening to the Meat Mafia podcast, we are so grateful to have you, and we are so thankful for your continued support. Before we get going, if you would not mind going and following us on all of our platforms, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and of course, Twitter, we would greatly appreciate it. This just allows us to expand our reach, and your reviews, comments, and feedback give us more and more things to think about and improve the show with. Lastly, this is a user-supported podcast and newsletter, and we would not be able to do what we love doing without your generous support and the support from our sponsors. We take great pride in the relationships that we've built with our sponsors and truly believe that they are the best resources out there for better health. Your support and their support, and you supporting them, means the world to us. If you are enjoying the podcast and getting value out of it, please check us out on the Fountain app below, where you can support us by streaming us sats or sending us support via our Fountain Bitcoin wallet. Without further ado, here is a word from our sponsors. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by the Carnivore Bar. The Carnivore Bar is a veteran-owned, animal-based company focused on bringing you the highest quality pemmican product on the market. Pemmican is an ancient tradition practiced by American indigenous cultures, and it's focused on simple ingredients: beef, tallow, and salt. It's built for grab-and-go snacking, and it's a great sort of travel, hiking, or school lunch snack. And it's really built for those long-lasting days where you can just run on basically no fuel other than just simple fats. It's rich in saturated fats and provides everything you need to sustain long-lasting energy throughout the busy day. In my opinion, this is a product that is an absolute must, so go check it out in the link below. Also, check out our podcast with the founder, Philip Meese. He does an incredible job breaking down the mission and the passion behind the company. And I think if you're interested in animal-based nutrition, Philip will inspire you with his product. This episode of the podcast is also brought to you by Holy Cow Beef. Holy Cow Beef is regeneratively raised, grass-fed, grass-finished beef raised right here in Lubbock, Texas. Regeneratively raised, grass-fed, grass-finished beef is the gold standard of beef, and Ann and Weldon Warren have made it their lives' mission to provide incredibly high-quality beef to their local community and beyond. They have been raising their animals this way for decades. In fact, they were some of the most influential voices for getting grass-fed and grass-finished beef in Whole Foods back when Whole Foods was a startup grocery store. They were influential in setting the AGA standards, which is the American Grass-Fed Association, so you know they are doing things the right way, and on top of all of that, their beef tastes like butter. Grass-fed, grass-finished beef provides a superior omega-3 to omega-6 ratio than your typical beef, or in other words, it causes less inflammation in your body. So you are promoting a high protein, high fat diet with this amazingly high quality beef, and saturated fats are playing their critical role in benefiting your body through supporting hormonal functions and cellular functions. And if you're looking for the highest quality beef, look no further than Holy Cow Beef. Leave your butcher box, that Australian and New Zealand raised meat, in the cart and order from your friends Ann and Weldon Warren over at Holy Cow Beef. I almost forgot the most important part there. Ann and Weldon Warren also accept Bitcoin as payment, so go check them out at their website in the link below, and you can pay in Bitcoin or in cash if you're looking to save your Bitcoin. I don't know about you all, but I am all about rewriting the incentives when it comes to healthcare, and Crowd Health is doing just that. Crowd Health is essentially crowdfunding for healthcare with a small HSA component mixed in. Paying through the nose for health insurance you may never use, only to be turned away when you actually need it, is incredibly frustrating. Also, the exorbitant costs of health insurance has so many baked in premiums that when you compare settling your doctor's bills by paying in cash versus using insurance, the cost is astronomical. So crowdfunding allows you to settle your medical bills in cash and then get the funding you need from your group through Crowd Health. This is a great alternative to health insurance for people who are low risk, healthy people who just want peace of mind knowing that if anything actually did happen, they do have a pool of funds to pull from to cover their medical costs. The best part, my group is saving a portion of the monthly opt-in in Bitcoin, and the rest is in cash. So those savings are going towards actually preserving long-term value for my group through a vehicle like Bitcoin. We are really excited about this concept, and since the business model is predicated on an incentive-based healthcare, it is a great concept. For people with low risk, minimal healthcare costs, it is a no-brainer. Go check them out in the link below and use our promo code MAFIA for a discount on your first 6 months with Crowd Health. Nicolette, welcome to the Meat Mafia podcast. It's a pleasure to have you. We are a huge fan of your book, Defending Beef, and it only feels appropriate that you're joining the Meat Mafia. So excited to have you.
Thank you. I am very happy to be invited.
Yeah, we're very excited. And I, like we were saying before we hit record, we had heard of Defending Beef before because people were really recommending it to us a lot once we started our show in March. And then we went to Austin to meet the Force of Nature team, and they gave us 2 goodie bags, a goodie bag for each of us. And in that goodie bag, your book was in there. So that's really how we started reading it. And it's been very instrumental to both of us. We've both followed a carnivore, animal-based diet. So that's kind of how we started going on our own nutritional journey. So that was like step 1. And then step 2 is really trying to understand where our food has come from. And I think your book does such a good job of addressing a lot of those issues. So I think as a starting point, Nicolette, we'd love to just learn a little bit more about your backstory and just ultimately your inspiration for writing the book when you wrote it in 2014.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, obviously, you guys probably don't have a lot of guests. You may have a few, but not a lot of guests that were longtime vegetarians. Maybe actually you do, because I've met a huge number of longtime vegetarians that are no longer vegetarians, and they have
some of our best guests.
Yeah.
Some of our best guests are reformed vegetarians. You may have had a few. Okay,
so I'm one of those. You can put me in that category. But I still probably have an unusual resume. So I started out, I grew up in Michigan, so, upper Midwest, not on a farm, but both my parents were actually taught at the local university, Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, where I grew up. But interestingly, I already sort of started being interested in farming and where my food comes from because my parents, my mother was from Germany and it was like just very into sort of making her own food. She used to bake a lot of bread and even make her own yogurt, and she had a big garden. And then both of my parents used to take us a lot to the local farms in the community. There's a lot of farming in southwestern Michigan and a lot of really high quality soil. And so we used to pick a lot of fruit ourselves, and we used to go directly to farms to get things like eggs and vegetables. And so I already had this idea as a child, like, well, one day I want to live on a farm, but I thought I would have this like long career and then I would retire to a farm. I didn't know. I had no idea the pathway I was going to take, but I was interested in this whole idea of just the life of farming and being on the land and being connected with the land through agriculture. That was something that's been in my mind for a long time. And also eating good food and basing your health, just trying to be healthy based on your food. And that was something that, came from my parents. Absolutely. And then I majored in biology in college. I went to law school. I went to University of Michigan Law School. And I began working originally as a prosecuting attorney. And then I, from there, worked for a law firm for about 5 years. And I had gotten very interested in the idea of trying to use my law degree more for some kind of public cause, but I really wasn't quite sure where I was going to go with that. And then I happened to see a speech in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I was living again. I had moved back to my hometown, by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who was an environmental lawyer and still is an environmental lawyer. And he was doing a lot of legal cases around the country for communities where they had pollution that was coming from large concentrated animal agriculture. And because of that, I was listening to him talk, and he was describing how he was using the law basically on behalf of the citizens, enforcing the citizen suit basically of the Clean Water Act. And that just got me thinking, like, wow, I would like to do something like that with my law degree. And I did not end up speaking to him when I first heard that talk, but I ended up kind of being inspired by that to apply for a legal position with the National Wildlife Federation. And I worked there for a while, for about a year, but I happened to have an opportunity to see Bobby Kennedy speak again. And I said to my colleagues at National Wildlife Federation, we got to go hear this speech because this is a really inspiring guy. And at that opportunity, I spoke directly to Bobby Kennedy. And I said, the reason I'm working as an environmental lawyer today is because I saw you speak. And he said, well, you should apply to my organization because we're looking for some people. And I ended up doing that. And he was in New York, and I ended up accepting a job with them. And then when I came to New York from Michigan, I had the idea that I would be using my law degree to protect the waters of the United States, basically. But he specifically wanted me to work on this issue of agricultural pollution. And I went to several places around the country where there were some really serious problems, where people that were longtime farmers, longtime residents, multi-generational ranchers and farmers were having problems with large concentrated agribusiness operations that were moving in nearby and were basically causing a lot of problems for their community in terms of the water quality and other things. And I realized that this was something that really needed to be worked on, that there was, a real need to try to improve the way animals are being raised for food. So I ended up doing that for the Waterkeeper organization and did that for 2 years, and basically just tried to get a lot of people working together and rally around this cause of let's improve the way we're raising animals for food, basically. And through that work, I met Bill Niman, who was a founder of a large network of hundreds of smaller scale traditional family farmers and ranchers. So who were basically raising their animals more or less on grass and without a lot of additives and feed additives and pharmaceutical additives and things like that. And that's how I ended up getting to know Bill Niman. And then I left that job after a couple of years, and I'm just sort of really fast forwarding it, a super short version of the story. I ended up marrying Bill Niman and moving from New York to California. And this is where I live today. I've been here for almost 20 years and been married to Bill for those 20 years. I went from being an urban environmental lawyer working in New York for an environmental group to being first just a resident of a ranch, and then over time becoming part of this ranch. So I spent 7 years working full time on the ranch. And then we have 2 sons. And when they were born, I started doing less work on the ranch. And that was around the time I was also starting to spend more time on my writing. And so I've done a number of books over the last few years related to meat and how animals are raised for food and what that means from an ecological perspective. Especially the Defending Beef book is also really focused on this question of human health and the importance of meat to the human diet. So I was vegetarian for 33 years. A few years ago, I started eating meat again, and we can talk about that all you want. But I have a long time background as an environmental lawyer, and then as an environmental activist, and then as a vegetarian. But today, I am really a huge advocate of animals in the food system because they're so important ecologically if you want to have really ecologically sound food production systems. And they're so important to the human diet, even for people who are, not doing what y'all are doing with, eating basically only meat. But for people who are eating omnivorously, which is, of course, the vast majority of people in the world who eat meat are basically omnivores. And the more I've learned and the more I've studied this issue, the more I believe with my whole heart that animals are invaluable to human health. So I'm kind of on this mission to make this argument, make this case that we can care about the environment. We must care about our health. And if we do that, we need animals in the food system.
Equip's unflavored prime has one single ingredient derived directly from grass-fed beef protein. For purists like ourselves who try to only consume balanced, real sources of nutrition, this protein powder checks all the boxes. Go check them out in the link below and use our promo code in the description to get a discount. Your story is amazing. I really love it. And it's something that resonates with me, is that it's clear that you were following your heart in a lot of the decisions that you were making, and doing things that were interesting to you and kind of drawing that passion out. And I'm curious, early on, you mentioned Bobby Kennedy had a big impact on you. What was it that he was talking about that like struck a chord with you? Because, you mentioned you were a vegetarian at the time, interested in environmentalism and kind of making an impact. But was there something that he was saying in particular that you were really drawn to?
Yeah. Well, this is, of course, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the son of the late Senator Robert Kennedy. And like his father and his late uncle, he's a very passionate person who cares deeply about a lot of causes. And what he was really talking about was this idea that every one of us, every citizen in the United States, not true in a lot of other countries, but in the United States, we have the power, we have a lot of power to actually affect what happens if we use that power. So he was specifically talking about the fact that the federal environmental laws of this country have a provision called the citizen suit provision, which allows essentially any ordinary citizen that is affected by a pollution, that's in their area, that's in their community, they can actually initiate a lawsuit to enforce that law. It's quite unique, that you can't think of very many laws that, we're aware of all kinds of different laws that affect all kinds of different things in our country. There are very few where you could just basically say, well, I'm going to enforce this law. That's what the attorney generals do. That's what, the prosecuting attorneys do. That is not normally what the citizens do. But there are some laws that we have in this country where a citizen can actually enforce a law. So the environmental laws are in that category. And because of that, if you are affected by pollution, you can actually enforce these laws. I mean, it's, you have to get a lawyer and, there's a process that you have to go through. But his work was to do that, to help people that are directly affected by communities to make the law be enforced. Basically, it's a simple concept. And I didn't really understand that there's a lot of politics behind enforcement of laws, especially laws like the environmental laws. A lot of them don't get enforced simply by not the agencies that are supposed to do it not getting adequate funding. So there are a lot of laws on the books that are not really enforced very much. And our job was to say, okay, there is a law here that is being violated. And we were specifically looking at a lot of the really concentrated hog operations, especially in places like North Carolina and Missouri, where there were a lot of pigs, and the pollution was simply spilling over into waterways and very routinely causing massive environmental problems. And there's a man that I began working with at the Waterkeeper organization called Rick Dove, who sort of became my mentor and colleague. He's a retired Marine Corps judge, actually. And he sort of was my main teacher in teaching me how he was working for this organization already because he lived in North Carolina and he saw all the pollution that was happening there. And he got kind of radicalized through this process of seeing all this pollution that was happening and no one was enforcing the laws. And so he got hooked up with Bobby Kennedy Jr. and they began working together to try to enforce the Clean Water Act there in North Carolina against the hog industry that was polluting the waterways there. And that was a lot of my work at the beginning of that project.
And Nicolette, those experiences working with Bobby Kennedy Jr. and the team, were those the experiences that were influential for you going towards that plant-based vegetarian diet, or was it something else that kind of had you gravitate towards that?
No, I became a vegetarian in college. I was already, it's funny because, you look back on your life and you see, well, what influenced me in this direction and why did I make that choice? And I think there were quite a few things that led to me choosing to be a vegetarian that I can sort of pinpoint now. And one of them is, there was that whole tremendous amount of discussion in the media in the 1970s, especially. I mean, it continues to this day, but it really started in the 1970s, suggesting that fat was bad for you, and that the worst kind of fat was animal fat, that the fat directly from meat or butter fat, fat found in milk, that kind of stuff was all really bad for you. And that was something that even my parents, who were generally really intelligent, thoughtful people, but they kind of bought into it. And they spent a lot of time thinking about food and eating healthfully. And so I remember parents thought, okay, we shouldn't have butter in the house anymore. We should have margarine. That kind of stuff was happening. And so there was that health issue that I thought in the back of my mind, it wasn't really a healthy choice to eat meat. And then when I went to college, I'd already been involved in environmental causes for a long time, and I was a biology major. And I just remember there was a lot of discussion about this idea that if you are eating meat, you are contributing to environmental problems, and especially, the deforestation of the rainforest, in the Amazon. And this idea too that it was too resource intensive. Like if you're eating meat, you're taking food from somebody else's mouth, right? So these ideas were all kind of really kind of bubbling up in the 1970s, and I started going to college in the second half of the 1980s, so quite a bit later. But those ideas had been around me for all of my childhood, and my parents were not vegetarians, but I heard all these ideas being discussed. And when I got to college, I just thought, geez, if I'm going to be an environmentalist, I should not be eating meat. And looking back on that now, I think that was something that was building up in the back of my mind for a long time. And so when I was at the end of freshman year of college, I stopped eating meat. But the first thing I did was I stopped eating beef. Because I thought beef is the worst. Beef is the one that's really bad, right? Yep. So it's so funny now for me to think that I thought that, because that's just not at all what I believe today. But I know now that was kind of my thinking at the time.
And when did your thinking start to change? Because you lay out a really compelling case in the beginning of your book with a lot of these like Livestock's Long Shadow, like some of these articles and papers that sort of shape the narrative.
Right.
And they're kind of hard to overcome if you, are only kind of absorbing that information. So I'm curious, like how you saw through it and started to change your thinking a little bit.
Well, it was a long time. I mean, I have to say one thing that's important is that I sort of grew up in this, again, this sort of family that spent a lot of time outdoors and was quite interested in being out in nature. And so I never had the idea, and I never accepted the idea that there's something wrong, like from a moral or ethical standpoint, with humans eating meat. And I think if I had gone into that space, then I might not have, changed my thinking over time, because that one is harder for people to undo. When they get into that, value system, then it's a much bigger task to unwind your thinking on it, right? But my thinking was more, like I was saying before, sort of health and environmental issues. And it really was when I was working for Bobby Kennedy that I began to realize my views were quite simplistic, because, as I say in my books, it's more like I was kind of just taking the pamphlet, and accepting the arguments. And when I was actually working on a daily basis on issues related to the meat industry as an environmental lawyer, I was really looking at the data. I was spending a lot of time visiting farms and ranches. I was talking to a lot of scientists about this. I mean, especially on the environmental side, but also on other aspects like, animal welfare questions and sociological questions, things like rural development and, impacts on communities, things like this. I was looking at the issue from a lot of different perspectives, but I was definitely getting the feeling pretty early on in the work that it was way too simplistic to simply, paint the meat industry with a single brush. And what I started doing pretty early on in the project was feeling like we should try to seek out some good examples of farms and ranches that were doing things in a really maybe not optimal. Optimal is kind of a strong word. Like nobody's really doing anything optimally. I mean, nobody anywhere, on any place ever is doing anything optimally, right? But people who are really striving to do things really well. And I saw some beautiful examples of this in my travels around the country, and I started to feel like what we should be doing with the environmental sort of campaign that we were leading to try to reform the meat industry was not just be pushing for better environmental practices at the big operations, which is a lot of what we were doing, but we should also be trying to highlight really good examples. And that's actually how I met Bill Niman, because the Niman Ranch farmers, there were so many of them where I visited their farms and ranches, and I just saw what was being done on the land, what was being done, the sort of the community connection to the farmer ranch, the food that was being produced. It was like, it was something that I knew we wanted to support and we wanted to highlight. And so almost, I wouldn't say, I think it has evolved a lot over the years, but it became clear to me fairly early on that I wanted what I was working on to be more than just like opposing meat, because I was never interested in doing that. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, you actually did a great job of answering one of my questions. I was going to ask you, prior to meeting Bill and marrying a rancher, I was going to ask you if you were anti-animal agriculture, but it seems like with those experiences that you had with, Bobby Kennedy Jr., that you were being exposed to some of these incredible farms that were doing things the right way, and it opened your eyes to what a farm could actually look like, regenerative practicing and utilizing the land the right way. Is that correct?
Yeah. And I would say it even goes back to my childhood when I was on farms quite often in southwestern Michigan, where I saw a lot of farms that had, a diverse, they were raising things like, fruit, they were raising vegetables, they were raising dairy animals, maybe some chickens, producing some eggs, whatever. So there were animals on a lot of these farms that I was spending time on. And I always thought that was a lot of what made farming interesting, and I did not have a depth of understanding about ecological issues and the soil health and all that stuff, which I learned about later. But in my mind, I would never want to live on a farm that didn't have animals, because that's just what makes it so fun and interesting. And, and in fact, one thing I've noticed, I have this huge community on social media that are involved in agriculture. And sometimes some people are just really small farm people, but some of them are pretty, full-time professional farmers. So it's kind of a diverse group, but I a lot from what they say and their posts and what they comment on my stuff. And one thing that continues to strike me to this day is that the people who are raising these animals for food they really appreciate these animals. So there's a kind of a perception that if you're raising an animal to kill it, perception outside of agriculture, okay, which unfortunately is the vast majority of the population these days, and that in the United States and in the industrialized world, all of it, is that we're really removed from agriculture, right? But one of the things I love about social media is we get to bridge some of these gaps. And there's a lot of social media stuff I don't like, but there are some really good things about it. Okay. And one of the things I am just struck by again and again is the stories that people tell each other, we share with each other about this animal or that animal, or, the beautiful photographs of not just like a herd of grazing animals, which is beautiful, but a single individual animal and what's happening with that animal and its story. And that interests that person, and that interests me too, and so I realized this perception that if you're raising animals for food, you obviously hate animals or whatever, it's so wrong. It just couldn't be more false. And especially the type of farms and ranches that I really enjoy visiting and working with, the people who are doing the sort of regenerative farming and, sort of really, really intellectually challenging farming that has a lot of components to it and that is really trying to model natural systems. Those farmers and ranchers invariably are people who are passionate about taking good care of their land and their animals.
Yeah, we had the pleasure of being on White Oak Pastures property in September, and it was like you're like on hallowed land. It's amazing just being there and being able to talk to Will. He's so open, just willing to share all the information that he's gained over the decades of working on the property and changing his practices, and just hearing like the unique interplay that happens between all the animals. It's so cool. And just for two people from the Northeast who don't really have that perspective, we were raised in the city. So being able to go to Bluffton, Georgia and just hear Will Harris talk about regenerative agriculture and what it's actually doing to the land. I mean, it's like a total life-changing experience.
Oh, good. I'm so happy to hear that. I've been to his farm as well, and I consider him a good friend. And I'm a huge fan of what he's doing and his whole family. And I'm in awe, to be honest, with what they've done, not just with the animals and with the land, but economically. They have like revitalized the economy of the region that they're in, and provided all these diverse types of economic development and products. And it's amazing. I'm so happy when I hear people are basically making pilgrimages there, because it deserves it, Yeah. But
he has that amazing study too on carbon sequestration, which I don't think really had been done before, right?
Yeah, I talk about it in Defending Beef. They hired a third-party environmental auditor. And what they did was they tried to figure out, for everything we're doing on our farm, what is it basically, what are the inputs, and then what are the outputs, and what impact are we having ecologically, and especially with respect to carbon. And they found, it's pretty fascinating result. They found that, everything that basically humans do has some, cost, and, if you want to think of it that way, is in terms of carbon, in terms of how much people are putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that can be in terms of CO2, carbon dioxide, or it can be methane, CH4. But they tried to look at all their things they were raising on their farm and what they were producing, and try to figure out, like, okay, what's the actual carbon impact of this, or the carbon effect? And what they found was that the grazing that they were doing was putting so much carbon into the soil. It was adding so much carbon into the soil through the, this sort of animal impact, which I described quite a bit in the book. And basically allowing, triggering this whole process where the plant takes, basically through the energy of the sun, and it takes carbon out of the atmosphere, and basically through the plant and through the roots, basically, to sort of say it really briefly, it's putting carbon into the soil. And this is all fostered and triggered, catalyzed basically by the presence of grazing animals. And so they actually found that there was a net negative effect in terms of the carbon impact. So they were not just not adding carbon to the atmosphere, they were actually subtracting it because they were putting so much carbon into the soil. And what's so interesting about that whole idea is that we haven't, thought that much about it as humans until the last decade or so. But the practices that humans were doing around the globe in terms of raising food through agriculture all over the world was basically degrading soil for the most part. There were some exceptions to that, but most of the cultures around the world were basically wearing the soil out over time. And the whole American story, in fact, of the Europeans, at least, coming to the New World, was they were basically they were creating farms, and then they would kind of wear out the soil, and they would sort of move west. That was that's very gross overgeneralization of what was happening, but there was a lot of that going on. So what, we have learned, and what we've really started figuring out in the last couple of decades, when we think about soil biology and soil health, is that you have to regenerate the soils in order to have, not just to be able to keep farming in a place, but to be able to produce healthy food. Because what's happening with the biology of the soil, and how much carbon, but not just carbon, how much life there is in the soil, that will affect the nutritional quality of the food that's produced. And so many other things. It also affects the water holding capacity, et cetera. And so what Will has shown on his farm, and this has been shown elsewhere as well, but he's been showing specifically that where you have good grazing practices, you actually add more carbon and you make healthier soil, so that over time, your farm is getting healthier and healthier. It's not degrading. It's not losing its capacity to produce food. It's increasing its capacity. And he's created this amazing model where there's all this complexity to it in terms of lots of different kinds of animals, different kinds of plants, and, all different kinds of things that they're raising there and products that they're producing from the farm. And they're showing that actually when you do this well, you actually have a net beneficial effect on lots of different aspects of the ecology of the farm, but in particular on the carbon. So this whole discussion about, beef always causing global warming, supposedly, especially through methane emissions, he's kind of helped people like me show that we need to sort of flip that on its head a little bit and say, if you raise grazing animals well, they are part of the solution.
And to that point, Nicolette, do you think, as we think about spreading the proper role of beef in a healthy environment, that it's going to be more and more important to gain funding for studies similar to what was done on white oak, so we have a bigger sample size of farms to showcase?
Yeah, well, I always support, as I mentioned before, my background is as I was a biology major in college, and I have two sisters that are both medical doctors. I'm a big believer in, science and research, and, I have my own issues with some of it, but there's also a lot of garbage going on out there in the world related to all that. But we need it. We really need to know. We need to learn. We just need to keep learning and exploring and trying to understand the natural world. It's so complex, and like nutritional issues on the, sort of the other half of the stuff that my books talk about. We know so little about human nutrition, and we're just beginning to get some, I think, decent understanding of some of the things about in terms of how it all works. But so I'm very supportive of that. But that being said, at the same time, I always want to put the caveat in there that I don't think we need to wait for research to know we need to act. So we know there's just no question at all that our food system right now is not producing healthy food, and it is also causing a lot of ecological harm. And so action is required, and this is kind of like I feel like my books are a clarion call for, we really need to rethink the way we're farming and to make some significant changes. And we have these beautiful examples like Will Harris's farm in Bluffton, Georgia. And there are many more. I mean, his is kind of an exceptional example, but there are many. I travel a lot, and I've seen many good farms and ranches all over the place. And so there's a lot of good stuff happening. And so we need more and more research, and we need more and more telling of those stories, and more understanding of what, how the best practices, what they look like, and how you can adapt those to wherever you live and wherever you're farming or ranching. But so I guess, I want to say, yes, I support more research, and I think it would show, it would be helpful, but it's not necessary in terms of what needs to be done and the action that needs to be taken.
You sit in such a unique position with your environmental background, your legal background, and some of the things you've already mentioned were the concentration of sort of these corporate interests in food and in agriculture, but then also just the politicalization of some of these studies, and honestly, just like, people are protecting their profits in certain ways with some of these studies. So your perspective is really unique, specifically when it comes to the environment. And I'd love to unpack some of these studies that have happened over the years and some of the big narratives around the environment when it comes to beef, like methane you talked about. There's just all these like misconceptions when it comes to the environmental case against beef. I'm curious, like, what do you think those big picture arguments against beef, are that people are hearing, and kind of like what are the pamphlet answers for, why people should start to think a little bit more critically about, beef's role in the whole ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, this is so key, the issues you just laid out, because, I was just giving a talk a few weeks ago, actually, in Wales and in the UK, and a woman said to me, "Well, what about methane?" And so I thought to myself, Jesus, she just threw one word out there, and now I need 20 minutes to give an adequate response, but nobody's going to listen for 20 minutes. So I have to sort of somehow, I mean, literally, it's like you throw a Molotov cocktail or something. And then, it takes like a lot of effort to like put it out, but it just takes 1 second to throw that Molotov cocktail, right? So methane is like that Molotov cocktail. It's like, it just takes 1 second to throw that word out there. And actually the woman who asked me that question in Wales was fairly sympathetic to my position. So she wasn't even like attacking me per se. She was just kind of saying like, okay, well, what about this? What do you think of this? And what do I say when people ask me about this? And so I was happy to respond, but it was also like, I recognized in that moment, like the frustration, like it's hard to give an accurate, a true response, something that's actually correct and is also succinct, because the issues are complex. And this is the whole problem right now in, I think, our whole, digital age, and the way we get information and social media is everything is done. This is why I love podcasts, because we can actually like have conversation. We can like talk about stuff in depth. But most information, so thank God for podcasts. Okay, so thank you guys, for what you're doing. But for the most part, most people are getting their information in these little sound bites all the time, right? And so what I try to do, I mean, obviously I try to be succinct wherever I can be, but I also try to actually put some of that nuance in there and put in some of the detail and put in some of the science, because I am passionate about science and I'm passionate about evidence, both from my legal training and my legal background and from my scientific background. And what I think is there were so many years, I mean, that Livestock's Long Shadow report that you mentioned is a great example. That actually was a detailed scientific study. They really spent a lot of time putting that together. There were a lot of people who worked on that at the United Nations. In some ways, there was a lot of credible information in that report. But it's kind of the way it's been spun over the years and the way it's been used by advocacy groups that's so troubling. So even the press office itself at the United Nations put out a press release that was totally inaccurate. And the authors said as much a little bit later. They acknowledged, they said in the press release when the Livestock's Long Shadow report came out in 2006, they said that the livestock industry actually produces more global warming gases than all transportation combined in the world. Well, that turned out to be completely untrue. Okay. But that was what happened is the report authors put together a statistic that said, it's at that point in time, they said 18% of greenhouse gases come from livestock. And then the people in the press office looked at that and said, oh, that's even more than the transportation sector. So we're just going to say that. Right. Well, that wasn't true at all, because they used a totally different kind of methodology to produce those two numbers. And if you used a sort of full life cycle analysis for the transportation industry, it would be way more. Okay, so then the livestock industry, but also that figure itself turned out to be too high, and it was reevaluated by the United Nations. And a few years later, they came out, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, they reduced that number down to 14.5%. And that number is really too high when you're in a place like the United States, because that's talking about the global figure. Okay, and when you look at it's much more meaningful to talk about the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced in the country that you live in. If you're trying to figure out, well, what should I be doing? What is my personal contribution to this? And also, what laws should I be advocating for? What should I be talking to my elected officials about that I care about, that we should be trying to address? Because in the United States, and these are the official figures from the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the United Nations for the United States, that is that all of agriculture of the United States is only about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions for this country. And all of the livestock, all of the grazing animals, all of the ruminants that are domesticated ruminants produce somewhere between 2 to 3% of our greenhouse gases. So this idea that, it's more than transportation, and there's even been these ridiculous claims that it's more than 50%. Those are just totally out. Those are off the wall. And I do go in my book sort of through those figures and dissect them and show why they're false, but they don't really even merit discussion because they're so off the wall. But even the really sort of more credible figures, like this 14.5% figure from the Food and Agriculture Organization, it's way too high, because first of all, it's not applicable to the US at all. And in the same report where they said it's 14.5%, for all livestock of the world to greenhouse gas emissions, they also acknowledged that actually there's quite a bit of carbon that is sequestered in the soil from even just from the existing systems. So it doesn't even talk about potential of what you could do to improve. But they said, because we don't know what that number is, we're not going to apply that to this, but it could mitigate perhaps significantly this 14.5% figure. So what that tells me is we know that 14.5% figure is quite a bit too high, and even for the globe, global figure. And then if you look specifically at the United States, we know that it's way too high. So we're really talking about all of the beef and all of the other grazing animals like sheep and goats contributing somewhere between 2 to 3% of the greenhouse gas emissions for this country. So that doesn't mean that there's nothing there. And I talk in defending beef about the fact that when you have good grazing practices, you reduce the amount of emissions and you increase the amount of carbon that you put in the soil. And we talked about Will Harris's farm already as one example, where you have a really good grazing system and a really well-managed system, you can actually have a net effect of taking carbon out of the air. So it's just a massively oversimplified conversation that's taking place in the world and in this country right now. And the bottom line is that we need better food systems and we need better systems for raising animals, but it doesn't mean we need to get rid of the animals in the food system. And in fact, if you do that, you'd create all kinds of, obviously you guys are particularly interested in the nutritional side of this question. I mean, I can't even imagine, I would love for somebody to sort of come up with some sort of modeling where they try to figure out all of the health problems that would be created over the next few decades if we took all of the animal-based foods out of the food system and replaced it with the sort of artificial foods that people are often replacing those with when they take those things out of their diet. Because I'm 100% convinced that if you did that, you would have a dramatically worse public health than you have currently. And we already have a very problematic public health situation. So, everything like obesity and diabetes and all the metabolic diseases, everything would get worse if you took the animals out of the food system. So to me, the studies are useful, but they're problematic. And they're certainly not, you have to take all of them with a grain of salt, every single one of them.
You really do. It's really interesting to think about this connection between social media and understanding the role of beef, because like anything else, right, it's such a double-edged sword where social media is ultimately how we discovered the carnivore diet, which led us to understanding regenerative agriculture, which is why we're even having you on this podcast. That's amazing. Right. And then also the velocity of social media, people know how to cherry pick certain statistics and data and create infographics and the sound bites like you were talking about. So your people are taking this incorrect 18 or 14.5% study, creating an infographic with it. People in the plant-based community, or maybe people that are just middle of the road, they come across it and they're like, okay, this is every excuse that I need to now give up animal protein and ruminant agriculture, which is leading to some of these adverse health outcomes like you're talking about. It's really a matter of misinformation. That's probably a result of like the rapid social media usage that we have. It's just really interesting to think about it from that context.
Yeah, I just think the whole, the way people are exposed, and I had a kind of an epiphany on this a few years ago. We were, for most of, and my father was a history professor, so I always think about historical context and everything, but we were, for the vast majority of our history and prehistory, humans didn't have very much information. The sort of spread of information, it was really just in the hands of a few people, and even in every culture. And the vast majority of people were illiterate and had very little information other than their sort of immediate surroundings and their family situation and maybe their clan, their tribe, whatever. And then with, the advent of writing, then all of a sudden you could advance technology so much because you could share information, you could record things, you could, and there was sort of a rapid increase, but then there was a lot of people that were illiterate. And so just for thousands and thousands of years, The whole problem was that there wasn't a good way to disseminate information and that people didn't have access to that information. And then suddenly, with the advent of the internet and especially social media, it's almost the reverse problem. We have way too much information. It's like a fire hose. Spraying information, quote unquote. I mean, it's not even like, because so much of it is just totally false, and it's like kind of almost like not even correct to call it information, but it's stuff, like stuff that we're being told, and and anybody's an expert, and so it's just crazy. So our whole task nowadays is to like sift through it. And as someone who is trained as both a scientist and as a lawyer, where your whole sort of trajectory of what you're trying to do every day is to try to get at the truth through your different methods, gathering evidence, looking at sources and credibility, and just try to figure it all out. To me, that is the challenge right now for modern humans that are trying to live in an ethical, smart, helpful way, is to sift through this fire hose of information that's being splattered at us all the time. And also, I have to say, this is a little off topic, but I just want to throw this in here. I increasingly think we need to sort of tamp down a little bit how much of that fire hose we're exposing ourselves to. So like, in other words, not getting that, 24 hours a day, bing, bing, bing on our Apple Watch with the news update, whatever, not being quite so addicted to this like splattering of fire hose of information. Just like calming ourselves down a little bit and, staying grounded into what's true and then choosing selectively what, news sources and what things we want to take in as information. And then not getting so hysterical about the day, 24-hour news cycle and just kind of allowing ourselves to stay calm and stay true and look for that truth. And, anyway, that's a little bit of an off-topic branch there, but I just wanted to throw that out there too.
No, it was great. And especially like the past handful of years, right? Like, I feel like everyone bites at the first headline that's thrown in front of them on their, whatever iPhone, Mac, or whatever their news source is. And they just bite at whatever's thrown in front of them. And, usually there's more to a story than the first breaking news piece that comes to it. So
exactly. I mean, I actually am starting to feel that enough people have gotten so exhausted from this whole fire hose of information that people are beginning to pull back from it a little bit. So I almost feel like I may be wrong. I may be overly optimistic here, but I feel like we're maybe over that hump a little bit. And people are beginning to say, wait a minute, I need to just like have a little bit less stuff flung at me and be a little more careful in terms of what I'm spending my time looking at. And getting a little more discerning and wanting to dig in a little bit. In fact, I think, like I was saying before about podcasts, I think the growth of podcasts is to some degree people's answer to trying to get a little bit deeper into some things, and to do that in a way that where they can really just listen and do whatever, gardening while they're listening or whatever, but not just have this like headline after headline that you're just binging at you all the time.
Yeah. How do you unpack the complexity of the food system situation that we're dealing with and I think it's like, my question is coming from two perspectives. One, where it's like, we need to feed people. And then the other one is we need to address a lot of the environmental problems and topics that you brought up before, which really is only supported through this idea of, I think, localized food. And you mentioned like take action, don't wait for regulators or people to sort of tell you what to do. We always talk about voting with your dollar, but is there anything that you speak about when it comes to the complexity of how we should approach this situation?
Well, one thing I would say is I think it's good not to allow yourself to get overwhelmed. I think when we're all deciding what to eat, I think our primary baseline should be to try to figure out what works for you. Okay. So there is no one diet. I really believe in this very strongly. And I believe this more and more over the years. There is no one diet, I think, that is correct for every human being. And so I think every one of us has a different set of needs that we have based on our ethnicity, our age, our gender, our life experience, what's happening in our own body, our gut microbiome, all these things. And so one thing is to try to begin to understand what our own bodies require and thrive on, and not get too caught up in any one set of solutions that anybody's going to try to foist upon us. So I would say, and a lot of it is too just sort of using some common sense and listening to your body. And again, I have to say there was a book that I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but Dr. Fred Provenza, who's an animal nutrition scientist and amazing human being, and he wrote this book called Nourishment, which had a huge impact on my thinking. So like I have kind of moved steadily in certain directions in terms of my thinking, but he kind of like jolted me in that book. I read it twice. It got me really thinking about, are we even just asking like the wrong questions when we talk about food and health and diet? And one of the things that he says in there that I thought was so interesting, he says essentially, we've known what to eat. Wild animals know what to eat. Domesticated animals know what to eat. And he's shown that through his own research for 3 decades of studying, especially ruminant nutrition and health. But he says, why do we accept this idea as humans that we need an expert to tell us what we need to eat to be healthy? I mean, just like an interesting question. It's like, oh my gosh, that's a very good point. And so but his whole argument essentially is that we have an internal mechanism, that our physiology is developed in such a way that we know how to recognize foods that are really nourishing. And that if we are especially reared by mothers and parents that and other family members who expose us to good food, that we develop this nutritional wisdom further, and that we all have this capacity essentially to recognize when something is providing us what our body needs. And the reason that's so interesting to me is because it takes the debate about food out of the sort of binary things like plant and animal, meat versus no meat kind of thing, because it's suggesting that, first of all, each of us has really different nutritional requirements, and that we can figure out what those are by listening to our bodies and by learning how to nourish ourselves from lots of different ways. But also that so much of modern food is not even capable of providing our bodies, clicking in that mechanism of recognizing its nourishment, because it's so processed. It's so things are, we start in agriculture these days with producing food that isn't nearly as nourishing as it once was, from soils that are depleted, and using breeds and varieties that are lower nutritional value than the foods were historically. And that includes meat and eggs and dairy, just about everything. And certainly all the plants that are fruits and vegetables, everything. And then we process them. We store them, we transport them, we process them, and then we eat them. So by the time it gets to your mouth, it's so much of what Americans especially are eating these days is basically devoid of, sort of the secondary compounds and the phytochemicals, the things that he writes a lot about and that Dr. Fred Provenza writes about. Things that our bodies really need to thrive. And so we don't even enable ourselves to recognize what we need and to figure out how to fully nourish ourselves, because we're eating food that is so distant from what we evolved eating. So there's just so much to say on this topic, obviously, but I forgot what your original question was. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but Fred Provenza is one of the researchers out of Utah State, correct?
Yes.
They've done some amazing work. We had Mark Schatzker on, who talked at length about Fred Provenza. And
yes, I read his. I know Mark, and I read his book, The Dorito Effect, and it's awesome. And it's largely about Fred Provenza's work, in fact. So great! I'm so glad that you're tapped in with those guys, because it's fabulous stuff. Yeah, and there's a lot of research now looking at. Do you guys know Stephen Van Vliet? I actually don't know him. know his work. So
we've had him on the show. Luckily.
Okay, awesome. So he's looking at that sort of literally at the cellular level, kind of at the microscopic level, what is happening with nourishment and with our bodies, and showing there are vast differences between foods that we think are quote unquote sort of nutritionally equivalent. And that goes back to this idea of, real foods that we evolved with, and then this idea that we can sort of create laboratory foods that are equivalent. Or maybe even, I saw an interview a few years ago with the founder of one of the fake meat companies, the high-tech new fake meat companies, saying that he was creating food that was better than meat because it had, quote, all of the good stuff and none of the bad. And I thought it was like the ultimate moment of human hubris. Like, really? Do you actually think you personally know what all those things are that are good and that are bad, quote unquote, good and bad, that are contained in meat? And actually, the stuff that he was talking about, I didn't even agree with pretty much a word he said about what was supposedly bad. Like he was talking about cholesterol, like, oh, cholesterol, we don't have any of that because that's such bad stuff. I was like, well, actually, cholesterol is necessary for human health, So he was kind of using, in my opinion, very outdated perceptions about, what's even bad. But this idea that we can ignore, this connection that we have through our evolution, in what we've been eating all these millennia, right? And that we can just forget about, and we can just go into a lab and create something that's going to be better even than basically nature's products. I thought was so absurd. But it's another, I think, manifestation of the fact that the vast majority of people in the United States live in urban areas or suburban areas. They're not connected to the natural world or understanding how nature works or the cycle of life that exists out there. And this idea that, technology can solve everything, and everything, you can make the best food. I mean, if you listen to a lot of these people like Bill Gates talk, and anything that you could pick a fresh fruit off of a tree, but it wouldn't be nearly as good as something that he could create in a vat in a lab, right? So absurd. And plus it's disgusting. It tastes disgusting, that stuff, It's like the pleasure of eating is completely ignored. And that, to me, that's one of the most important pleasures in life. So why would you ever just throw that aside?
100%. And it's concerning too. You have to give some of these companies credit. They do an unbelievable job of marketing and being able to promote propaganda. And there's millions of people that actually believe that, eating Beyond Beef gives you as many nutrients, if not more nutrients, than real beef, like
right.
grown from your husband's ranch. That's better for you than the environment. So I wonder if you ever think about, is there anything that this regenerative movement can maybe be taking from the plant-based movement? Not that we want to propagate in the same way, but like, are there things that maybe we should be thinking about doing in terms of promoting animal agriculture that the plant-based community has done or the fake meat community has done particularly well?
Well, I mean, to me, in a way, I feel like they've made some fatal errors. We know there've just been a whole bunch of news stories. I mean, it's so funny, again, kind of watching the news cycle. They're all enamored with fake meat a couple of years ago. And there were like 1 billion articles about how this is the future of food and everything. And now they're kind of falling out of love with fake meat. So now there's a whole bunch of articles about how horrible it is and how, the workers are having bad working conditions and the plants are dirty and contaminated and the food is not the companies aren't profitable and the shareholders are losing money and blah, blah, blah. So, it's like they're kind of in this falling out of love phase right now. So that's sort of amusing to watch. But honestly, I think they've made some fatal errors because they have this thing I was just talking about. They have ignored the fact. And in fact, I've had some really interesting conversations directly with Pat Brown, who's the founder of Impossible Foods. And he basically, his whole idea is that, I'm just going to sort of put this on him. He didn't say these words, but this is my interpretation. He would be perfectly happy to get up in the morning and take a pill if it could contain everything he needed nutritionally, and then go to bed and get up the next day and do the same thing the next day. he's not, I think he personally doesn't take any real pleasure from food or eating. And I've gotten that same feeling when I've heard some of the other people in the what they call alternative meat space talking. And I think it's a really fatal error because it's the thing I was just talking about. I think food and eating together and cooking and gathering your food and growing your food, these are some of the most satisfying things that you could do as a human. And especially when you're you're rearing children and you're teaching them how to cook and how to eat well, and you're trying to give them good habits, and you're also just having that daily pleasure of eating a meal together. These are things that really matter. And in fact, I just read George Monbiot's book. I think it's called Regeneration, if I can remember his title correctly. But it's basically, he's a vegan. He just thinks we should get all of our foods out of vats and stuff. He spends a lot of time in there talking about his own cooking, sort of like trying to convince people. So I think he's recognized that this is a problem with the whole sort of like technological food space. And so he sort of talks about it. But you read his descriptions of his meals and they're just so sad. I'm like, really? Is this your attempt to sound like it's mouth-watering? Because it's not. It sounds horrible. But I think there's this countervailing trend. At the same time, there's all this like excitement and hype about Silicon Valley and these alt meat and these high-tech solutions. There's this other very strong groundswell that I've encountered all over the country of younger people who are really interested in learning how to grow food, learning how to cook, raising some of their own food, having gardens, apprenticing on farms. I mean, in fact, it was super interesting, this trip that I just took. This was over in Europe, but I was in England and Wales and Norway, and every farm that I visited, and I visited several of them, they had several people that were apprenticing on the farms that were all in their 20s, that were, all of them were really well educated. There were not people even who grew up on farms, but they really wanted to be involved in regenerative agriculture. And they were totally devoted to this sort of relearning the wisdom of, the ancestors, for lack of a better word, but, understanding, sort of recapturing that connection with nature, learning how to produce food in a really healthy way that produces, that regenerates the soils and produces nutrient-rich foods, and then eating really good food. And in fact, at every one of these farms, I spent a bunch of time with these young people, and we'd all sit together at the dinner, and we would eat this really delicious food that had been raised right there on that farm, and have these beautiful, wonderful meals and have great conversation around the table. And I thought, wow, I've had this kind of experience many times, but this was like a bunch of places right in a row. So it was like a really, dense experiences all compacted. And I thought, I have a lot of optimism. I see this, this real dedication and this passion among people in their 20s and 30s to seeking out this knowledge and to being part of the solution and being part of really rebuilding the food system, almost, literally from the ground up. So, so I'm not that pessimistic, and I don't really think that the alt meat people honestly have that much to teach us. In fact, I don't think they have almost anything to teach us.
Well, I think it was Pat Brown in Vinnie Tortorich's documentary it's called Beyond Impossible. He said if he could snap his fingers, he would eliminate all the cows from the face of the earth.
Yeah. Oh, he's very passionate about eliminating animal agriculture. So yes, for sure. But I also realized, like I said, I haven't heard him actually say this, but he doesn't seem to care about food or eating from the perspective of that sensual pleasure and that communal pleasure. And I think it's actually really fundamental to what makes us human. And so the idea that you can just toss that aside and that means nothing is, I think they're making that a very huge error with that analysis.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a pretty amazing thing what happens when you source your meals intentionally, you cook your meals intentionally, and then you eat with people intentionally too. It's like the only word that I could use to describe it is it's just this amazing, nourishing experience that I think a lot of millennials have awakened to over the last couple of years. Like Harry was in Boston, I was in New York, and you're kind of just going through the motions up there. You're ordering out a lot of your meals. And then I went carnivore like right before COVID started. So that opened me up to the nutritional space. But since that time, getting out into Texas, starting to connect with local farmers, share these community meals, it's just unbelievable what can come from that. It's like a totally new world is exposed to you when you start to add that as just part of your life's routine.
That's awesome. That's exactly what I've seen as well. So I'm glad to hear you guys are having that same experience, because that's what I've been seeing too. And it is still not the mainstream or the dominant model, but there's a lot of it happening. And so I have a lot of optimism about where it's all heading.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's our show. One of the questions that we always ask is about whether you're optimistic for the future or not. And most people seem to share the similar optimism. But I think change happens in these unique ways where it doesn't take a whole lot of people. It just takes a small group of people who truly believe to their core that what they're doing is going to make an impact. And it does seem like there is that growing wave of people who are really caring about these topics, which is great. I think there's a lot of really good information getting put out there. But I think one of the things that you put in the last chapter of your book is kind of around some of the incentives in agriculture that stand in the way of some of that progress. Mm-hmm. You talked about like monocrop agriculture and how that kind of funnels into feedlot agriculture. Do you see that being a hurdle that we can overcome?
Yeah, I mean, there are certainly a lot of barriers. There's a lot of stuff that is, a lot of entities are very vested in the status quo. I mean, that's kind of always the case, right? So that's kind of why, it's interesting. When I started working on this stuff like 20 years ago, I thought one of the main things that we should be doing is like pushing for some good federal legislation, and the more that I've worked on this stuff, the more I've I don't do anything with that anymore. I mean, not that I would not, embrace it if it happened, but I have so little faith that we're going to see anything that's really helpful coming out of Washington on any of this stuff. That being said, there are a lot of smaller initiatives that I see that are really exciting. Things like here in the Bay Area, everybody knows who Alice Waters is. She's the founder of the restaurant Chez Panisse in Berkeley. And my husband has worked with her for a long time and known her very well. But I happened to spend a few hours with her a couple of weeks ago. And it was just so inspiring hearing about what she's been doing and her people that work with her to get gardens in schools. And it's such a small thing, but the permutations are amazing. And what she was talking about and how it just helps people from a very early age begin to connect themselves with soil, with food, with their health, with cooking, and just make the connections and then want to be a part of it. And just and how it just opens up people's eyes and minds and begins to nourish them in a much healthier way. And a lot of the schools that she's been working with for a long time are places where a lot of the students wouldn't get a lot of healthy food at their home. So this is a place where they're going to get nourishment of a quality that they wouldn't ordinarily even be exposed to. And so that's like a little program in a way, putting school, gardens in. And yet it's so inspiring. And there are thousands of them now in the US. And it really just started from one farm, one small garden in one school in the East Bay. And so there are a lot of barriers and there is a lot of inertia, but there's also a ton of very exciting stuff happening all over the place. And on the local level, on individual school level, I'm on the school board for my kids' school. And I know we're just one of many, many schools we have a garden at our school, and we're having conversations all the time about how we can have more connection between the students and the garden and the cafeteria and the food that they're eating. And, and this kind of stuff is happening all over the country. That same conversation is taking place all over the country. So that's just one example, but there are so many things happening. There's things happening, a lot of different state initiatives, like in California, there has been a program that's incentivizing improving your soil practices for farmers and ranchers to learn how and to actually be incentivized to take better care of your soils and get, not just more carbon into the soils, but have healthier soils overall. And it's just going to take 1,000 things like that. Mm-hmm. And the good thing is it's happening, and we need more. We need a lot more of this kind of stuff. But I like your point about it doesn't have to be everybody, and it doesn't have to be the federal government. I think that a lot of there are lots of those small groups of people that you were talking about, and there are lots of individuals in urban places and suburban and rural places that are doing really inspiring things. So I actually think we're going to see a very, very different conversation and a very different food system in another couple of decades. It's some really exciting and interesting things are happening, and we're not going to totally replace, the sort of industrialized food system that we have today overnight. But I think that there's some, resilience too is really important. So I think people are recognizing from just the standpoint of sort of the security of our nation, being able to feed ourselves and not being so interdependent. I mean, we obviously are interconnected globally, but we need to be able to feed ourselves. Our communities need to be able to feed ourselves. Our nation needs to be able to feed itself. And so I think that there's a lot of conversation around that these days too. I think there's a lot of good things that are happening and a lot of reason for optimism in spite of those barriers that you were mentioning.
It's amazing. I meant to ask you this. Were there any predictions that you made around 2014 that when Defending Beef came out that have turned out to be true, or maybe things that you thought were going to happen that just haven't materialized yet for whatever reason?
Well, I did talk about one thing that was interesting is I talked about the sort of defensiveness of the beef industry and just it's a sort of unwillingness to acknowledge the problems that people were pointing out with the way animals were being raised and the ecological effect. I think we've come a long way on that. And I had a really interesting conversation with Dr. Alan Williams a few years ago where he teaches people how to improve their grazing practices and so forth. And he said to me, 20 years ago, I was giving talks and I would have 3 or 4 people in the room. And now I've got 1,000 people in the room. So these are people that are in agriculture. And so what I'm seeing is, and this is almost more than I would have expected, the amount of interest within, the beef industry and among beef farmers and ranchers themselves, and just within agriculture in general. I think there are so many people who are acknowledging that the current system is not working, whether it's because it's not profitable for them or because they're recognizing that the health of their land is declining, or that they feel like their own health or their family's health is declining based on, having been exposed to a lot of chemicals. I mean, there are just lots of issues, lots of ways in which I think the sort of veil has fallen off of people's eyes in terms of, people were kind of blinded by this idea. We're going to feed the world. We're going to produce lots of food. We're going to use a lot of chemicals. We're going to use a lot of pharmaceuticals. We're going to use all these industrial practices. We're going to have big buildings and big machines, and we're going to, just kind of churn out more and more food, and productivity is the bottom line for everything. I think that whole paradigm has come, I wouldn't say totally crashing down. There's certainly people who are still clinging to it. But a lot of people in mainstream agriculture are second guessing that now and are really questioning that now. And so that to me is something I might not have anticipated. And I'm happy that that's happening more so than I would have expected.
Yes, it's always exciting to see when the big players start having a change of heart or start seeing things differently, because I feel like it takes a little bit more effort to kind of open or make changes at that level. So it's definitely it's great to see some change happening at that level. But Nicolette, this has been such a refreshing conversation. I think our audience is going to get a ton out of it. So we just really appreciate all the work that you've done in terms of publishing the book and coming on the podcast and just sharing your knowledge with our audience. This has been great.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I think we had a lot of interesting topics that we covered. So I hope that people will enjoy listening. And thank you for the work you are doing, because it's so important. Like, we're all I think grappling with how do we get more people to look at these issues a little deeper. And I think the podcasts are super important. So I really appreciate what you guys are doing.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nicolette.
You're welcome.